Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Biggs. I'm the congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District. I'm joined today. I'm happy you're here with me, but I'm also really happy to have two wonderful advocates from the East Valley to talk about schools and openings. So we have with us, we have Laura Crandall, and I'm going to read her bio, and we also have Becca Clarkson. So let me read Laura's first. She moved to Arizona from Baltimore, Maryland 2.5 years ago and loves this desert state. And let me tell you, if you're east of the Mississippi, you can't imagine what desert life is like. Just like as a kid, I could never imagine what green was. I always thought Arizona was green. She works as a stay-at-home parent as well as a local wedding videographer. Laura earned her bachelor's degree from BYU, Idaho in public relations. She has 2 children, ages 5 and 3, who are both currently starting kindergarten and preschool programs. She works as a volunteer youth leader for teenage girls in her community and is deeply concerned for this generation and the opportunities we are taking away from them. She values freedom, small government, and people making choices for themselves and not taking choices from others. That's a great bio. And Becca, your bio is just as good. So Becca Clarkson is originally from Utah and has been a resident of Arizona for 17 years. She graduated from BYU with a bachelor's degree in elementary education and has a master's degree from the University of Arizona in information resources and library science. Becca spent 9 years in the public school system, with 8 of those years teaching for Mesa Public Schools. After much frustration with the politics of public education, Becca left teaching and is now working in real estate. She still supports public education, but would like to see reforms addressing current problems. She lives with her husband and their 4 children in Mesa, where they enjoy remodeling and running an urban farm. So you might have to give me a lesson on remodeling here before we're done. But I'm so thankful that both of you would take time with us and share your views. It's so important. And so when we talk about it, when you talk about advocating reopening of school, tell me what you mean by that. Let's start with you, Becca, and then Laura chime in.
Sure. We are advocating for reopening schools. We are advocating for the choice to go back to school, for the option. We understand that not everyone feels the same way we do. And so we don't want to force anyone back who isn't comfortable. We don't want to force any teachers back if they have certain risks or family members that are at risk. Any parents who don't feel comfortable sending their children, that's their personal decision. But what we're finding is that there's a big gathering of people who want to go back, and their voices aren't being heard, and we're not even being given an option. In-person school means kids are in the classroom with teachers in the classroom, and they're experiencing all the benefits of physical in-person schooling.
And Laura, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I think Becca hit it on the head. We're just looking for options. We don't want to take away choices from other people, and we feel like the options that we're advocating for are not working out for us. And so we've needed to kind of raise our voices and try and find people that are of this same viewpoint. And we're trying to do what we can in order to be able to just be given more choices that work for each family and educator.
So one of the things that we've seen is districts have sent out questionnaires. They send out surveys to parents, what do you want? And I've seen some of those come back, and I'm always surprised that the administration is always surprised that parents want their kids back at school. Tell me, how's that input being received by administrators, and expand, if you will, and we'll start with Laura this time, on why they may not be getting the approbation that you would expect them to get.
It's been really concerning for us because we are receiving a lot of the local survey results. And I'll use Gilbert as an extreme example. Their survey showed that 89% of families wanted to send their kids back to school. And I don't know what the teachers was, but it wasn't too far off from that percentage. And they are actually one of the districts that have already voted to push back schools. They did so before the benchmarks were even released. And so it makes you wonder, as a resident, who why are these results not being taken into consideration, and how are our voices really not being heard, even when we're trying our best to have people listen to us and hear that that is our preference?
So let me just clarify. They're sending out surveys to both teachers and parents,
Yes.
and the Gilbert Unified sent it out, and 89% of parents said, yeah, we want to be back. We want our kids back in school.
Right.
And somewhere in that same ballpark, teachers said, yeah, we want to be back in school.
Yep, that's what happened.
And administrators said, no, we're not going back.
Right. And so that's where we're running into issues, is because we've voted these people into these various political positions, but they're not representing how the majority of the public feel. And we are very empathetic. We understand that COVID is a reality, but at what point do you go, it's risk versus reward? At this point, keeping schools closed, you got to decide what risks you are and aren't willing to take. And we would never force someone to take risks they don't want to take, but it seems like we're not being given any options, even though from what we've seen, the majority of people are comfortable with sending their kids back.
Yeah. So Becca, what do you want to expand on that just a titch?
Sure, a touch. Laura said, the risk versus the reward. And there's a doctor, Jeff Barkey, out of Orange County, California. He specifically spoke on this, and he said that kids need to be back in school. He said children are not the carriers of the disease. They're not spreading it. He said that under the age of 25, you are 50 times more likely to die from drowning than from COVID. And that makes me think all these people want us to stay home, and they want me to keep my kids home, even though the CDC and the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the CDC have come out and said that children need to be in school, that it's critical for their development. So they want me to keep my kids home. It's like if I went around and said, well, I found out that drowning is a much greater risk for you. I think you should all fill your pools full of dirt. No one should have a pool. That's ridiculous. I can assess the risk for my family and decide what I'm willing to do for the benefit of public education.
And I was glad you mentioned the risk reward, because when I've been talking to epidemiologists, virologists, docs from all over the country about all of these issues. And the one thing they say to me is, Andy, you can't be talking about safety, because safety implies that there is absolutely no risk. Right. And there's nothing in life that we do that doesn't have some measure of risk. Yeah. And this gets to something that you guys said when you said something to me, and I'm going to skip ahead to this because I think it's a great segue to it. And this notion of risk, we know that all the data there's lots of data, lots of science in saying that children are not super spreaders. Children are very unlikely to get sick. CDC has said the percentage of children who would die of a COVID are 1 in a million. The number of kids who get sick from COVID and the number of flu, if you put those together, you're 4 times more likely to get the flu if you're a child. So these are really important statements. And so when we talk about this risk reward, and teachers are saying, some of them are saying, well, we don't want to get sick. And
they're saying they don't want to risk their lives. That's right. What they're saying.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. I mean, that's exactly what they've taken it and immediately started throwing obituaries and tombstones out there. And
literally. They wrote their obituaries. I don't know if you know that they wrote.
I do. Okay. I've seen it. It's astounding. So how, and you're doing the same thing I'm doing. What's the disconnect? So you have parents in Gilbert, for instance, and you've got teachers in Gilbert, roughly the same ratio, saying we want to be back in school, but the administrators are not responding that way. What's driving that failure to take the risk in there? And we'll talk in a second about risk of keeping kids out of school. But what's driving in your mind? And then I'll tell you what I think in part is doing it. This notion of we're going to just kick this can down the road. Laura, let's go with Laura.
It seems like we're having a problem. We have unions that have been talking to different educators and have done big kind of PR and marketing online, getting a lot of people that were maybe previously on the fence about whether or not they felt safe about going to school that are now very much extreme, that it would be a risk to their life, to their families, to their livelihood in order to enter the workplace. But the data does not support that at all. And like Becca said, kids are not contracting COVID. And so teachers are one of the last professions that are re-entering the workplace during this pandemic. And they are luckily re-entering with the least risky people to be around. And so at what point do we go, I mean, and I love educators. My sister is a local 5th grade teacher. Becca was a teacher. We love our educators, but I don't value any human life above another. And so we have people that are working in Walmart with adults who are a lot more likely to potentially have COVID. And we expect people to assume that risk. And so why are we not expecting the same thing when we know, that teachers are essential, education is essential. And so it seems strange that one occupation can claim that it's too risky for them when every other occupation has resumed working, because that's what society expects and needs of us.
So Becca, as you see this, and we saw some mandates come out, or I won't say mandates, guidelines from the state. You've got districts that have basically shut down already, regardless of what the guidelines may be, and regardless of what the science will be. And what have you been able to do you think, to maybe shine some light on these problems that we see and failure to open up?
So up until now, there's just been some various, small social media groups and whatnot. And we kind of teamed together and we started a group, a social media group, advocating for in-person education. And we've seen a good following these last couple of weeks. But with the start of school, these last few days or last few weeks, parents are really fed up, and we're seeing our numbers climb, and we're seeing a lot of support. And I've had teachers reach out to me privately. As I was a teacher, I know a lot of teachers in the area, and they reached out to me and said, will you speak for us? Because when they speak, they're getting a lot of threats and a lot of pushback against what they're saying. And so most of them don't feel comfortable speaking out publicly. They don't want to speak at our rallies. They don't want to be seen at our rallies, but they have reached out to me privately to let me know they want to be back in the classroom, but the union is strong and it's silencing them.
Right. And so both of you mentioned unions, and I will just tell you, if you go and look at the documents that Arizona's teachers union has put out, what you'll find is, they encourage them to do the fake obituary, do the tombstones, really try to personalize and sensationalize it. And then they say, and then let's band together with people of like social consciousness, like
Yes.
Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
And so, and you have around the country, so we've been Arizona centric, but if you look around the country, the LA Teachers Union, they've said that they don't want to go back until LA defunds police, for instance. Right. So it isn't necessarily a matter of mitigating risk, which is what I think both of you, in fact, all of us say, well, let's mitigate risk where we can,
right.
But let's acknowledge what the science is. So we get moving this way, and you both have talked about this, and it's freedom of choice. So if you have teachers who want to come back in the classroom and teach, and you have students who want to come in, and parents who want their students in, I guess all three of us are advocating to let us make that choice.
Yes.
And I want to get to this. The risk. So the American Academy of Pediatricians has said it. CDC has said it. There's other scientists and other data that's out there, and it's available. They've said the risk of being in school for children, and quite frankly for teachers, is lower than the risk from being out of school. So Becca, tell me, before we started, we were talking about some of the social pathologies that have taken hold during this time. How how are they gripping children who are outside the classroom and who will not be brought back in the classroom?
Okay, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm talking about the social pathologies, the other public health crises that children face
Yes, okay.
when they're not in school.
There's a lot of problems. The emotional health is definitely at risk. We found out that suicides are up, that depression is up, domestic violence is up. We're also having a lot of incidences where people are infiltrating the online virtual schooling systems, and children are being exposed to inappropriate content. There was something that just happened recently that if that had happened to my child, I would be livid. And the schools aren't protecting our children from any of these. They're not considering all the negative aspects of school closures. The children are feeling a lot of anxiety. They feel that there's something strange going on. They've lost their sense of normalcy. And one of the things that I really feel strongly about is the role that public schools play in our community. They give that emotional and social exposure. They give the ability to conform to authority. They give the ability to learn when not to conform. They give those peer experiences, and they give a safe place for a lot of kids who come from low-income families or families that need some help.
Yeah, so we didn't even, as we talked there, we did not even touch upon educational delay and slowing of development educationally. Expand on that if you can.
I think that there's going to be lasting consequences for making these decisions. And I think when we prioritize COVID over every other pre-existing societal crisis that already was around prior to this pandemic, then we are going to see so many issues. And it's so problematic, especially for the kids, for all the reasons that Becca said. We already had a mental health crisis. We already had kids that were using way too much screen time to the point where it's not healthy. And so we're taking all these things that already existed, abuse, human trafficking, they've lost all their mandatory reporters. There's just so many things that we're going to see happen because we've made the decision to close schools. And it's tragic. There is no better word.
Yeah, and so what I would say is I see a lot, and I've written about this quite a bit, is there is a secondary public health crisis that is largely being ignored because we're so focused on COVID-19.
I mean, when you hyper focus on anything, something has to give, right? And so this hyper focusing on COVID has left us susceptible to so many other issues. And that's, I think, where a lot of us are getting really frustrated is because, like, I've been reached out to and told, you are not being empathetic. I've always known you to be a nice person. And I'm like, I am just as empathetic as I've ever been. The thing is, you are empathizing with the people that are directly contracting and potentially dying from COVID. And I do feel terrible at that. And I recognize that that is a reality, but I am also empathizing with the problems that the overreaction to COVID has caused. So. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's right. I mean, we could get into the whole history of it, but what we've seen is the governor has done a couple things that, like, they issued guidelines today. But I have to talk about one thing that just baffled me like crazy, and that's when he said we're going to kick back in-person schooling, but because not every kid has someplace to go, we're going to open up the schools effectively to become child care centers. But doggone it, we're not going to educate them while they're there. I just didn't really understand that. And did I misread what the governor said? I mean...
Crazy, isn't it? They're willing to let your child into school if you're willing to pay, on average about $160 per week per child. So, for me with 3 kids, that's almost $500 a week. So my kids can be somewhere so I can work. And that's another side effect that we're experiencing is that parents who need to work to provide for their family, they're unable to do so. We have 8 million people in the country have been laid off recently from the COVID crisis. And if you have a job, you've got to do everything you can to keep it, and yet we're not able to have our kids in school, which is one of those other things that public schools provide for our communities.
Yeah. So and it seems like a remarkable inconsistency for me to say, yeah, schools are okay if you pay.
But we are paying already.
Yeah, we're already paying.
But we pay more extra.
Yeah, we're gonna charge a fee, and then doggone it, we're not gonna teach those kids.
Right.
They're just gonna come and.
They're still on their computers. They're there at school with headphones and masks.
And a warm.
Yeah. So crazy. So let's talk in the last few minutes here. Let's talk about the guidelines that came out today, and the way I understand them, they're first of all, okay. I wasn't going to do this. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm just going to tell you what I understand. Then I'll let you guys comment, and then I'll respond. The new case rate has to be down to 100 per 100,000 for 2 consecutive weeks. And then I was going to make a comment. And then the positive test rate has to be below 7%, and then hospitalization rate
5%.
The 5. Okay. So
5%.
Even worse.
The reports I read.
Less attainable.
The reports I said says 7. So
Okay.
If it's 5%, it makes it difficult, even more difficult. And then the hospitalization rate has to be below 10%. All right. I'd love to hear you guys respond. Go ahead, Laura. We'll go first to you, and then we'll go back.
I mean, I'm not a statistics or math person, but even I can see that it would be very hard for us to go back to school this year if those numbers are what we need to obtain. And I'm all about wanting COVID to go away, but at what point are we able to control a virus, right? And so it makes it very tricky to know as parents what we're supposed to do at this point. Do we pull our kids out because we don't want to online school indefinitely until we reach an arbitrary number, and so it makes it very hard to make decisions. And so I think that's where a lot of frustration is coming in for parents. Everyone wants to do right by their kid. No matter how afraid you are of this virus, you want to do right by your children. And I think it's hard because there's been a lot of confusion. A lot of things are unclear. And so we don't know our options. We don't even know sometimes who are fighting. And so I think they've done a very good job at making it so confusing that we don't even know what we need to do to advocate for our children, because there's fingers pointing in every direction. And so it makes it so difficult as parents who want to speak out. We're like, who do we contact? Here's a list of 30 emails you should reach out to. And most of those don't respond to anybody from what we've seen on our group Facebook page. So it's so hard as a parent right now to know what we should and shouldn't be doing. And I think those benchmarks were an ultimate blow. Those benchmarks, mind you, are not laws. They are recommendations. And so from here, we want to push the districts to understand them as such. Unless that number really is more obtainable than my mind can comprehend, maybe it's not as crazy as I think it is. But either way, I mean, schools can open. They would just need to go against the recommendations that have been given by the state.
Yeah. Becca.
Sure. A few things about those numbers. First of all, you said 7, we said 5. I'm going to just glance over at my notes. It said in those benchmarks that were released, it said when it reaches less than 5% positivity rate and less than 5% COVID-like illness.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not even saying it has to be a positive test, which again, those test numbers, we have heard so many discrepancies about how they're testing. We've heard the positivity. Last time I checked on our county health website, it states that the positivity rate includes the serology test, which is antibody tests, which are not new positive cases. Those are people who've had the virus who knows when. Sometime. They suspect it's been in the United States since the fall. So those numbers they're just unrealistic because A, we don't trust them. B, they're including serology and COVID-like illness, so they're not a direct representation of the positive new cases. Second of all, 5%, people aren't going in and getting tested because they have nothing else to do. They're getting tested because they're sick. So when you look at those positivity rates, you're going to see, it's just not a realistic number. And then the important thing to focus on isn't if people are getting sick. People will get sick, just like you said earlier. Life is inherent with risk. Illness has always, from the beginning of recorded history and beyond, it has always been a part of being alive. There are illnesses, there are viruses, there are sicknesses. We've never said we're going to avoid getting sick. We just try to mitigate the risk. And so when you look at that, we're not seeing the deaths that we thought we would, the deaths that were predicted. We're just not seeing that serious of an effect from COVID, except for the shutdowns. The virus itself is not as devastating as we thought. And you talk about the hospitalizations. Doctors' offices won't see patients anymore because of COVID. So if you're sick, where do you go? They go to the hospital.
Yeah, those are all great points that both of you made. I'm going to throw a few more points on there that really bugged me as I was reading through this. But you both touched on this. These numbers are arbitrary. There is no scientific data or basis to say once you hit 5% or 7% or whatever your net positive test rate is, that it's all of a sudden you're ready to go back. That was always the problem with the very nebulous idea we're going to flatten the curve. Because what does it mean to flatten the curve? Well, no one ever said this is what it means to flatten the curve. So when you start moving this way, it's all arbitrary. And so specifically, if you move to 100 per 100,000 new cases, and you have to do that for 2 weeks, I think you're right. I think we're way down the pike. And why is that? I'll just give you some data. Roughly half of all of our positive tests that we get today are in the 20 to 44 age group. Why is that? Well, they're more active, they get out, they associate, etc. The other thing is, a lot of them are going back to work, and their employers are saying, before you come back to work, we want you to get a test. So they go get a test. The test really doesn't mean anything, because if you're asymptomatic, you're not shedding the virus. So the test rate itself is a stat that really is inconsequential, especially since the CDC said that they believe that the test rate, the number of people who actually have had coronavirus is at least 10 times higher than the positive test rate. So in Arizona, can you imagine what that would mean? That would mean that we're talking a good 20 to 30% of the population has already had COVID. Right. And then, so I think these rather arbitrary numbers really bug me. But the other one is the hospitalization rates. The net hospitalization rate is irrelevant in the sense that what you were looking at is you want to see what is the infection fatality rate. And the infection fatality rate, it continues to decline in Arizona. And where we were 45 days ago was almost 4.6%. And now we're at just a little over 2%. That's a remarkable direction to be going, and that's where you need to be going. And you need to be going at your hospitalization rate. And if you look at the slope of the hospitalizations, it's a steady downward path. But by how you calculate your hospitalizations, that's gonna determine it as well. And they don't make that clear. So let me give you for instance, if you look at general beds or ICU beds, you're going to see that the COVID is taking up maybe half of those, 55% maybe of each, maybe a little bit higher in general beds. Is that the rate they're going by? Because if that's the rate they're going by, how many beds are actually taken up by COVID? That's going to be a different number than some of these other numbers. And if you show up in an emergency department, is that count when they discharge you? Are you looking at the discharge rate as well? Are you looking at the recovery rate? They're not looking at any of these numbers that actually have meaningful context to this whole issue. So, okay, so that's we've all kind of bagged on that for a bit, but it's justifiably so. So it leaves me with this question, and I've been talking about this nationally to different folks about this. If schools and states are not going to allow schools to open, traditional public schools open, what what I see is charter schools are going to open. They're going to open, and private schools are going to open.
Right.
So the question is, should you expand choice opportunities for parents who say, maybe you've got a special education kid who they've got an IEP. They need to be able to get to some place that can provide them with that IEP help.
Right.
And you're going to withhold funding for them because they're going to a charter or a private. Should we be looking at ways and I'm a big one about incentives, to incentivize traditionals by saying, well, okay, you guys want to stay close. We're going to move money with the kids so the parents can make a decision to get their kids in an in-person school setting that's best for that kid. What do you think about that?
Definitely. I think that that's the route we need to take, because if our tax dollars are paying for public schools, but they're not listening to the parents and the teachers who want to be back, if they're not going to listen to us, then our money needs to follow our children. I'm a big supporter of public schools. I believe they play such an important role, but if they won't listen to us, if those governing boards don't want to hear our voices, then I think that funding should go elsewhere.
Okay, well, we're about time to wrap up, but I will tell you this. I have tremendous respect for what you're doing, and I think you're advocating in the right way. You're true grassroots advocates, and you're going to the place that you need to go, and that's the school boards for these districts. The governing boards for these districts are the ones that you're hoping will be responsive to things like the surveys, things like parents showing up and saying, we want our kids in school. That's what you hope they will do. And that's, as a guy that's been in elected office for a while, I can tell you, you do want to hear from your constituents. You always want to hear that you're doing great, but I can tell you, we rarely hear that we're doing great. We always hear all the bad things we're doing, all the things we're doing wrong. But you really want to communicate with those constituents and try to resolve the issues. And so good for you. I think that's the way to go. And I think that, Becca, you made the point, and you're right on the money here, and that is, Laura, you also said this. These are guidelines. These are not mandates. These are merely benchmarks. And the benchmark doesn't mean you have to get it to go there to open up. It means that that's what the state's saying. So I will just say one last issue that we don't have time to get into is liability and risk. And this is why I think state legislature needs to get back in a special session, and they need to mitigate the liability risk to these school districts. I think if they did that, there would be it would diffuse any argument left. And I really think that's important. So
send me the waiver, I'll sign it.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the other option that's out there, is to sign a waiver.
I support it. I think we need more creative solutions. So many parents are willing to sign a waiver because they've already decided risk versus reward, and they know where they stand. And so it's all about choices. And so when the government takes away your choices, at some point, kind of like you said, you're going to look somewhere else for those resources, because our kids deserve an education. They don't deserve to be on the computer for 6 hours a day. And this is not an acceptable substitution for in-person learning. Absolutely. And amen to you. And thanks for your leadership on this issue and getting out there and taking it on head on. And I really appreciate your attitude. So let the chips fall where they may, because that's what happens in a representative republic that we have. Good for you. Thanks to Becca. Thanks Laura. Thanks for just getting out there. Thanks for taking a few minutes with me today. And with that, we're going to wrap it up and say goodbye.